Number 1. Deputy Zachary Wester. A traffic stop on a quiet panhandle roadway should have been routine. A defective brake light, a brief conversation, or a written warning, and everyone goes home. Instead, drivers in Jackson County, Florida, began learning a different lesson, that the outcome of a stop often depended less on what they had done and more on who had pulled them over. The deputy behind those stops was 26-year-old Zachary Wester, a uniformed member of the sheriff's office who carried a badge and presented himself as a dependable small-town lawman. On paper, he looked like one of the department's most productive deputies. In reality, investigators would later determine that some of the drugs he found had never belonged to the people he arrested. They had been carried into the scene by the officer himself. The story of how it was discovered began quietly, inside the sheriff's office. Supervisors noticed that Wester's drug arrests were unusually frequent. His reports were confident and detailed, yet the numbers seemed to outpace those of colleagues working the same roads. At first, the concern was administrative. Maybe he was just more proactive than the others. Then inconsistencies began to appear between what his written affidavits said and what his body camera recordings actually showed. In some traffic stops, it looked as if the important moments happened when the camera was off. In others, the video resumed only after Wester was already holding evidence that he claimed to have just discovered. The pattern was troubling enough that, in August of 2018, the sheriff asked the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to open a criminal investigation. Investigators began the slow work of reconstruction. They obtained Wester's footage, logged the times, and compared every frame with his sworn accounts. More than 1,300 minutes of body camera video were reviewed, along with dozens of arrest files. They followed each traffic stop from the moment lights activated to the moment a suspect was handcuffed and transported. What they saw was a sequence repeated across different roads and different drivers. A stop for a minor infraction, a request for consent to search, a private moment near a vehicle door or purse, and then the sudden discovery of a small bag of methamphetamine or marijuana. In several clips, investigators observed Wester handling something in his palm before the search began. In the paperwork, he described the finds as if they had simply appeared where he said he located them. One case, involving a woman pulled over for a brake light violation, captured the process clearly. She allowed Wester to search. The video showed him approaching her purse with a small object already hidden in his hand. Moments later, he said he had found narcotics in her purse. She was arrested, prosecuted, and placed on probation. Only when the investigation brought the full video to light was her case dismissed and the event re-examined as possible evidence tampering. Her story was not unique. Prosecutors ultimately dismissed about 120 cases in which Wester had been the arresting officer, concluding that the credibility of the evidence had been compromised beyond repair. By September of 2018, Wester was terminated from the sheriff's office. The criminal investigation continued for months, now expanding into his patrol car, his storage areas, and his history on shift. When Florida Department of Law Enforcement finally moved to arrest him the following summer, they charged him with 67 counts, including racketeering, official misconduct, perjury, fabricating evidence, false imprisonment, and possession of controlled substances. Investigators reported finding illegal narcotics inside his patrol vehicle, not logged as evidence or associated with any active case, reinforcing the allegation that he carried drugs specifically so they could later be found. In May of that year, the jury reached its decision. Wester was convicted on 19 counts involving 3 primary victims: fabricating evidence, official misconduct, perjury, false imprisonment, and drug-related offenses among them. He was acquitted on others, and the panel did not accept every theory the state had advanced. But the core allegation, that he had planted drugs and lied about it, was sustained. 2 months later, the judge sentenced him to 12 years, 6 months, and 8 days in the Florida Department of Corrections, noting that the damage extended far beyond individual traffic stops. Wrongful arrests meant criminal records, lost jobs, periods of incarceration, and, in at least one case, the loss of custody of a child. The courtroom recognized that misconduct by a sworn officer does not just distort a file, it reshapes lives. Today, Wester remains a convicted felon, serving a prison sentence shaped by court rulings that continue to evolve. The individuals he arrested have had their cases dismissed, but the consequences they endured cannot simply be reversed. The sheriff's office has had to rebuild credibility with the public it serves, and the state's legal system has added one more example to the growing archive of incidents showing what happens when authority is not met with accountability. Number 2. Deputy Christian Deadmond. Christian Deadmond was a deputy with the Rankin County Sheriff's Office in Mississippi. He worked narcotics, moved with other deputies in unmarked vehicles, and carried the kind of authority that allowed him to enter homes, search property, and make quick arrests. Inside the department, a small circle of officers developed a reputation for moving aggressively and taking control wherever they went. Among themselves, they used a name for it. They called it the Goon Squad. On January 24, 2023, Deadmond and several deputies converged on a home in Braxton, Mississippi, after hearing that 2 black men were inside staying with a white woman. They did not have a warrant, but they went in anyway. What followed was not a search in any conventional sense. Over the next hour, the deputies handcuffed the 2 men, Michael Corey Jenkins and Eddie Terrell Parker, and subjected them to a level of abuse that went way beyond regular policing. The men were beaten, shocked, and humiliated. Liquids were poured on them while racial slurs were used repeatedly. At one point, another deputy placed a gun inside Jenkins' mouth and pulled the trigger. The shot shattered his jaw and nearly killed him. As the scene quieted, attention shifted from what had happened to how it would be explained. The deputies began working on a story that would justify their actions and make the incident appear lawful. Part of that story involved evidence. According to federal prosecutors, a firearm and methamphetamine were introduced after the fact, positioned so that it would look as if Jenkins and Parker had been involved with drugs and illegal weapons. From there, reports could be written that painted the victims as criminal suspects, rather than as people who had just been assaulted in their own home. On paper, it could appear like another narcotics case where deputies had simply acted decisively. Once Jenkins was rushed for medical care, the incident could no longer be explained away. Investigators started asking basic questions, and the deputies began trying to line up their stories to match. Investigators later said the plan included lying about why they were there, how the gun was fired, and what evidence had supposedly been recovered at the scene. The intent was clear: protect the deputies, blame the victims, and close the gap created by an entry that never had a warrant. Federal investigators began pulling records, comparing accounts, and examining body camera gaps and communications around the raid. Once details surfaced, the picture became clear. This was not a fast-moving situation gone wrong. It was a deliberate series of unlawful acts, followed by a coordinated cover story, complete with planted items to make the case look legitimate. In August 2023, Deadmond and 5 other former officers pleaded guilty to federal civil rights charges related to the incident. The charges included deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy against rights, obstruction, and offenses tied to the discharge of a firearm during a violent crime. In court, they admitted that the raid was unlawful, that the abuse took place, and that false evidence had been used to frame the victims afterward. Sentencing came in March 2024. Deadmond received 40 years in federal prison, the longest sentence among the group. Other members of the Goon Squad were sentenced to terms ranging from roughly 10 to more than 20 years. Civil lawsuits soon followed, alleging that the behavior was not isolated, but linked to a broader pattern of unchecked power and warrantless entries. The victims of the raid sued Rankin County and the sheriff, seeking accountability for what they described as years of intimidation and abuse. Today, Deadmond remains in federal custody. The department he once served is still dealing with the fallout, criminal convictions, internal reviews, and public scrutiny that will last for years. Number 3. Sergeant Ronald Watts. Ronald Watts was a Chicago police sergeant who seemed to know every corner of the Ida B. Wells public housing complex. His team worked the stairwells, the lobbies, the parking lots, and the surrounding streets. On paper, they were there to fight drugs and guns. To many residents, though, it felt different. When Watts showed up, people expected trouble, and they expected to pay. Over time, residents began using a phrase that sounded almost like slang, but carried real fear behind it. They called it the Watts tax. The rule was simple: if you paid, you were left alone. If you didn't, officers would say they found drugs on you. Most of the people who complained already had records or lived in poverty. Their word rarely outweighed a sergeant's testimony in court. For years, the pattern stayed hidden inside case files. Arrest after arrest, plea deal after plea deal. Judges relied on sworn statements. Prosecutors trusted police reports. And the people caught up in the middle quietly went to jail, many of them insisting they had been framed. 2 Chicago police officers eventually began hearing the same story from different sources. They said that when they raised questions, they were told to leave it alone. Instead, they went to the FBI. Federal agents did not immediately reopen old convictions. They decided to watch, document, and wait for a moment they could prove without debate. That moment came in November 2011. A cooperating witness agreed to help federal agents. He carried a bag containing $5,200 in marked money. He told Sergeant Watts that the cash came from drug proceeds. Investigators watched from a distance. One of Watts's officers took the bag. When it was later recovered, the money was gone. Soon after, Watts met the informant and handed back only $400. The FBI now had surveillance, phone records, and a chain of events they could show in court. In February 2012, federal prosecutors charged Sergeant Ronald Watts and Officer Khalid Muhammad with theft of government funds. Both men eventually pled guilty. In 2013, Watts was sentenced to 22 months in federal prison. Most observers assumed that was the end of the story. Well, it wasn't. Once lawyers realized that a supervisor tied to so many drug arrests had been convicted of corruption, they began reviewing past cases connected to his team. People who had pled guilty years earlier finally had a chance to speak openly. Their accounts matched: demands for money, threats of arrest, and drugs that appeared only after officers arrived. In November 2017, a Cook County judge vacated 18 convictions in one day, all linked to Watts and his officers. It was the first mass exoneration of its kind in the county, and more followed. Over the next several years, judges reviewed old files and threw out case after case. By the early 2020s, more than 200 convictions tied to Watts's team had been dismissed. Appellate courts described the officers as unreliable. Some judges called it one of the most staggering police corruption scandals in Chicago history. The civil lawsuits that followed painted a fuller picture. Plaintiffs said Watts wasn't simply enforcing the law, he was running his own system inside the housing complex. People paid to avoid trouble. Those who didn't pay faced narcotics charges that prosecutors now suggested had never been legitimate. In 2025, the city of Chicago approved a $90 million settlement to resolve more than 170 lawsuits. Together, the wrongfully convicted had spent nearly 200 years in custody. What made it possible for so long was not one decision or one moment. Many of the people charged were already distrusted by the justice system. The cases involved low-level drug offenses that rarely drew attention. And officers who tried to raise alarms said they faced pressure to stay silent. That combination allowed misconduct to continue until outside investigators forced it into the open. The Ida B. Wells homes have since been demolished, but the impact of the scandal remains. It changed how Chicago looks at police oversight, wrongful convictions, and the cost when authority is abused. For the people exonerated years later, the legal system eventually corrected itself, but only after careers, families, and years of freedom had already been lost. Number 4. Sergeant Wayne Jenkins. Wayne Jenkins was already known inside the Baltimore Police Department as a productive officer long before anyone outside the city ever heard his name. He had joined the department in the early 2000s and worked his way into plainclothes units that were supposed to focus on guns and drugs. Supervisors liked his arrest numbers. Colleagues said he never stopped pushing for the next seizure. By 2016, he was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of an elite squad called the Gun Trace Task Force. On paper, their job was simple: find illegal guns and get them off the street. But the way the unit worked was different from what most people would imagine when they think of police investigations. The officers operated in unmarked cars, wearing plain clothes, often moving without clear supervision. They boxed in vehicles, ran aggressive stops, and searched people and houses with little explanation. To the public, It looked like proactive policing. To many of the people who encountered them, it felt like being targeted by a crew that answered to no one. A key moment that later defined the entire scandal began years earlier, in April 2010. In West Baltimore, officers in unmarked cars started following a vehicle driven by a man named Umar Burley. His friend, Brent Matthews, was in the passenger seat. Neither man realized they were being followed by police. The cars behind them had no obvious markings, and the officers were not wearing uniforms. Burley thought he was about to be robbed. He tried to outrun them, but after a few minutes of pursuit through the streets, his car crashed into another vehicle, carrying an elderly couple. 86-year-old Elbert Davis was killed. His wife, Foza Kane, survived but was seriously injured. Burley and Matthews were arrested on the scene. What happened next would shape the case for years. According to federal prosecutors, there were no drugs inside Burley's car when the crash occurred. But soon after the arrest, officers reported that heroin had been found in the vehicle. Roughly 28 grams were logged as evidence. Jenkins wrote paperwork saying the drugs had been recovered legitimately during the search. Burley and Matthews were charged with federal narcotics offenses. Both men said the heroin was planted. They believed they couldn't win against a police sergeant's word in court, so they pled guilty. For the next several years, Jenkins continued to rise. As leader of the gun trace task force, he was viewed inside the department as a high performer. The unit made gun seizures and wrote reports that supported their tactics. But underneath the statistics, something else was happening. Members of the task force were robbing people they stopped, stealing cash, taking drugs, and sometimes putting evidence on suspects to justify the arrest afterward. Some officers carried BB guns in case they needed to make a shooting look justified. They also falsified overtime records, collecting pay for hours they did not work. The wider investigation into Jenkins did not start with planted heroin. It began when federal agents, listening to unrelated wiretaps, noticed suspicious conversations involving one of the officers. That discovery led to a deeper look at the gun trace task force. Agents traced cash, examined reports, compared statements, and slowly uncovered a pattern of robbery, false arrests, and fabricated paperwork. By early 2017, the scope of the misconduct became clear. A federal grand jury indicted several officers, including Jenkins, on racketeering charges. Prosecutors described the task force not as an elite police unit, but as a criminal crew operating with badges. They said the officers used official authority to steal, threaten, and lie, all under the appearance of drug enforcement. Later that year, federal prosecutors revisited the 2010 crash involving Burley and Matthews. They stated in court that the heroin used to convict the men had been planted and that the case was built on falsehoods. The government took the unusual step of asking that the convictions be vacated. After years in prison, both men were cleared of the drug charges. The criminal case against Jenkins moved forward. He eventually pled guilty to racketeering conspiracy, robbery, falsifying records, and violating civil rights. In June 2018, a federal judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison. At sentencing, prosecutors emphasized not only the theft and fraud, but the broader damage. Innocent people imprisoned, a bystander killed, and public trust in Baltimore policing deeply shaken. Civil lawsuits followed. Burley and Matthews received a significant settlement for the wrongful convictions, and the family of Elbert Davis later secured compensation tied to his death. Altogether, city payouts for misconduct linked to the task force reached into the tens of millions of taxpayer dollars. Wayne Jenkins is now serving his sentence in federal prison. The gun trace task force no longer exists. But the impact remains visible in Baltimore court records, settlement agreements, and the lives of people who spent years behind bars because of falsified evidence. Number 5. Officer Michael Kilgore. Michael Kilgore was a patrol officer in the small city of Center, Alabama. He worked regular shifts, handled routine traffic stops, and served as a K-9 handler. He had only been with the department for a short time when he came up with an idea that would eventually expose him and cost the community its trust. In early January 2023, Kilgore pulled over a driver and found drugs inside the vehicle. It was the kind of stop that should have led to an arrest and a standard case file. Instead, he made a different decision. Rather than book the evidence, he told the driver he could avoid charges if he helped with something else. That conversation turned the driver into a co-conspirator, and it became the beginning of a scheme that had nothing to do with real drug enforcement. Over the next days, Kilgore and the man he had stopped talked about selecting a target. Court records describe her simply as a female driver. She wasn't a dealer, wasn't under investigation or part of any narcotics case. She was chosen because she could be used to create one. The co-conspirator bought methamphetamine, several Percocet pills, and a small amount of marijuana. He packaged the drugs and, following the plan, attached the bundle to the underside of the woman's car using a magnet. Kilgore knew exactly where it was placed. The goal was straightforward: stage a traffic stop, find the drugs, and make a narcotics arrest that would look legitimate on paper. On January 31st, 2023, Kilgore put the plan into motion. He stopped the woman's car and treated the encounter as a normal roadside investigation. After getting consent to search, he walked to the rear of the vehicle and recovered the package he already knew was there. Moments later, he arrested the driver and her passenger, transporting them to jail on charges built entirely on planted evidence. To anyone reading the report later, it appeared like a routine drug bust. The success of that arrest encouraged him. According to federal prosecutors, Kilgore then pushed his accomplice to do it again, this time with enough narcotics to justify a trafficking charge. More drugs were purchased, and another target was discussed. But before the plan could move forward, the co-conspirator changed his mind. He disposed of the drugs and went to law enforcement with the full story of what had been happening. That report triggered an investigation that reached beyond the local department. Agents retraced the traffic stop, reviewed phone records, and compared statements. What emerged was not confusion or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate effort by a sworn officer to manufacture arrests by planting narcotics on motorists who had no idea they were being set up. In May 2023, Kilgore was arrested by his own department on state conspiracy charges. He was fired as the investigation continued. Federal prosecutors then took the lead. A year later, in August 2024, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed a federal information charging him with conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine and announced that he had agreed to plead guilty. In court, Kilgore admitted what happened, that he had recruited a driver, planted drugs on a woman's vehicle, carried out a fraudulent stop, and arrested her and her passenger, knowing the evidence wasn't real. He also acknowledged that he had tried to plan a second plant before the scheme collapsed. In October 2025, a federal judge sentenced him to 48 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Today, Michael Kilgore is serving his federal sentence. The Center Police Department removed him and cooperated with investigators, but the damage left behind, the arrests, the fear, and the questions about oversight, remains part of the department's history. Number 6. Constable Michael Wallace. In Pulaski County, Kentucky, routine traffic stops kept turning into drug cases whenever Constable Michael Wallace showed up. He wasn't a patrol officer in the traditional sense. He was an elected constable, working mostly alone, using his own vehicle, and funding his work with property and cash he seized along the way. On paper, it looked like he was cleaning up the drug problem. For a long time, nobody asked many questions about how he kept finding so much. But then one traffic stop exposed the facade. Wallace pulled over a driver named Timothy Sizemore for an expired tag and called Somerset Police for backup. The officers who arrived searched the car carefully and found nothing illegal. When they were done, Wallace stepped forward and said he wanted to take a look himself. Within seconds, he reached under the driver's seat and produced a pill bottle he claimed had been hidden there. Inside, he said, were Percocet and suspected methamphetamine. To anyone reading the affidavit later, it sounded straightforward. But the officers on scene had just checked that same spot. They knew something was wrong. Quietly, they reported it to a supervisor. From there, the case moved beyond local law enforcement. As investigators dug into Wallace's old cases, they started noticing the same pattern. A stop might begin with something minor, maybe a small amount of drugs, but by the time Wallace finished the search, it had somehow turned into a trafficking case. Suddenly, there were scales, baggies, and extra meth that nobody else had seen before. His reports always explained it. He wrote that his canine alerted. He wrote that he found a bag other officers had missed. Bigger charges meant bigger seizures, and that allowed him to take cars, cash, and other property that helped keep his operation going. Pretty soon, investigators learned something else. Wallace kept methamphetamine at his house, not in a secure police evidence room, but in evidence bags, stored where he could get to them. Prosecutors would later argue it wasn't being preserved, it was being kept available. When he needed to make a stop look like trafficking instead of possession, he had what he needed. As the investigation grew, agents wanted to know whether Wallace was doing this only in past cases or if he was still doing it in real time. So the FBI decided to test him. They staged a tip about a man in a mall parking lot who was supposedly selling meth. An undercover task force officer waited in a truck with cash, but no drugs. Wallace arrived, pulled him out, went through his pockets, searched his truck, even went through his phone. He said the K-9 alerted. Another officer on scene said there wasn't enough to arrest. Wallace took him to jail anyway. It was one more example of how he used authority first and found justification afterward. By the time agents executed a search warrant on Wallace's home, the story was difficult to dispute. They found 5.9 grams of meth packaged as evidence. They traced earlier cases where he had added paraphernalia to scenes, written affidavits that didn't match witness accounts, and upgraded charges so property could be seized. Eventually, the federal charges came. Wallace and another constable, Gary Baldock, were indicted for conspiring to violate civil rights and for possessing methamphetamine with intent to distribute. At trial, jurors heard about the Sizemore stop, the traffic cases, the false affidavits, and the undercover sting. They learned that the distribution wasn't about selling drugs. It was about keeping meth ready to plant when it suited the case narrative. Later that year, a federal judge sentenced Wallace to 140 months in prison, just under 12 years, followed by 4 years of supervised release. On appeal, Wallace argued that the meth found at his home was simply stored evidence. The appellate court rejected the argument, saying properly handled evidence does not sit in a constable's house, available whenever he needs it. Number 7. Deputy David Scott Burroughs. On March 5, 2018, Deputy David Scott Burroughs walked up to a parked car outside a home in Anson County, North Carolina. It was quiet, and it was clear the owner wasn't anywhere near the car. Burroughs wasn't answering a call, and there was no warrant. He was there for one reason: to put something inside the trunk. Using a lockout tool, he opened the car, lifted the liner near the spare tire compartment, and slid a package into the space. Inside were narcotics and drug paraphernalia he had arranged to buy earlier: heroin, methamphetamine, marijuana, baggies, and a small scale. When he closed the trunk, nothing looked disturbed. To anyone passing by, the car looked exactly as it always had. But the next time it was stopped by police, the outcome was already decided. The man who owned that car was Ray Kiefer. He had started dating Burroughs' ex-girlfriend. Inside the sheriff's office, co-workers would later say Burroughs had become fixated on that relationship. He talked about it often. He searched Kiefer's name in databases. He began telling others he believed Kiefer was a drug dealer, even though no one had seen evidence of it. The breakup had turned personal, and the badge gave him a way to act on it. The day after the drugs were planted, Burroughs began setting the rest of the plan in motion. He called other deputies and said he had received a tip. According to him, Kiefer would be traveling through a specific stretch of road, and there would be drugs in the trunk. He even explained exactly where the officers should look. Some deputies hesitated because the level of detail didn't make sense. A few quietly refused to get involved. But eventually, the car was stopped. On March 6th, deputies opened the trunk, lifted the liner, and found the package sitting right where Burroughs had said it would be. To them, it looked like a solid felony drug bust: multiple narcotics, scales, and baggies. Kiefer was handcuffed, taken to the magistrate's office, and processed. On paper, it all read like a straightforward narcotics case. There was nothing in the reports to suggest that the drugs had been planted the day before. Kiefer's family refused to accept the story. They called the sheriff's office and insisted he had been set up. Sheriff Landrick Reed ordered an internal investigation. When supervisors began asking questions, the details started lining up, and the focus quickly shifted toward Burroughs. Deputies began admitting that Burroughs had reached out to them with information that was unusually precise. Some were so uneasy about it that they refused to take part. Others said that from the very beginning, the whole thing felt staged. During questioning, He first denied involvement, then his story shifted. Eventually, he admitted what he had done, that he had planted the drugs in the trunk. He was immediately fired, and the case was handed over to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Kiefer was released that same night, and the charges were dropped. The sheriff later said plainly, Kiefer had done nothing wrong. He was charged with obstruction of justice, making a false police report, breaking and entering a motor vehicle, and multiple drug offenses. He was ultimately found guilty of obstruction of justice and heroin possession and received probation instead of prison time. Kiefer filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. As the case moved forward, more details came out, including how some deputies suspected something was wrong but didn't escalate their concerns early enough to stop the arrest. Years later, the county settled. The sheriff issued a public apology acknowledging that Burroughs had planted the drugs, that Kiefer had been wrongly arrested, and that the entire case was built on fabrication. Number 8. Officers Joshua Judge and Tyson Toot. On New Year's Day, 2015, 21-year-old Kyle Weldon was searched by police in Des Moines, Iowa. Officers said they found a small plastic container in his front pocket, a rock-like substance, they wrote, and the test came back as methamphetamine. Weldon was arrested, booked, and placed in jail. On paper, it looked like a routine narcotics case handled by experienced officers. One of those officers was named Tyson Toot. Another, working cases alongside him, was Joshua Judge. Both were relatively young on the force, both assigned to patrol, and both writing reports that would later be treated as reliable evidence in court. Weldon sat in jail for more than a month. With his prior record, the charge carried weight, and the risk of a harsher outcome was real. Under pressure, and already behind bars, he took a plea and served the time that had effectively already passed, paid fines, and carried the conviction that came with it. There was nothing in the record suggesting anything had gone wrong. What nobody outside the department knew yet was that the case wasn't what it seemed. Almost 2 years later, a quiet concern inside the Des Moines Police Department began turning into something much bigger. Command staff received information suggesting that drug evidence in at least one case had not been found where officers said it was. Instead, it had been moved, taken from one suspect and assigned to another. The names connected to the allegation were the same two officers, Joshua Judge and Tyson Toot. The department launched an internal investigation. Supervisors began pulling files, comparing reports, and flagging inconsistencies. The Polk County Attorney's Office was notified, and state investigators were brought in. Very quickly, this was no longer about one arrest. Leaders publicly acknowledged that every case involving those officers would need to be re-examined. They described it not in dozens, but in hundreds and hundreds of files. As the review deepened, Weldon's case resurfaced. The substance officers said they found in his pocket was now tied to questions about how it got there and whose case it truly belonged to. The Iowa State Public Defender's Wrongful Conviction Division took a closer look. Prosecutors eventually returned to court and told a judge the truth. The conviction was built on evidence that had been improperly handled and, in effect, planted. In January 2017, a judge vacated Weldon's conviction, declared him exonerated, and ordered his record cleared. The fines, the fees, the jail costs, all were dismissed. For Weldon, it was confirmation of something he had always said. The drugs weren't his. Behind that decision, the consequences for the officers were unfolding in different ways. Both Judge and Toot resigned from the department during the investigation. Prosecutors focused most directly on Toot. He was charged with misconduct in office and perjury, accused of taking methamphetamine tied to one suspect and logging it as if it belonged to someone else. The allegation was simple in structure, but devastating in meaning. A police officer had manipulated physical evidence to create a stronger case. By June 2018, Toot stood in court and pleaded guilty, not to the original felony, but to a reduced charge of non-felonious misconduct in office. He was sentenced to a year of probation and ordered to pay a small fine. Other charges were dropped as part of the plea. He did not go to prison. Joshua Judge, meanwhile, faced no criminal charges in the public record, but left law enforcement under the cloud of the same investigation. Number 9. Officers Kyle Ericson and Elmer Pastran. Officer Kyle Ericson was already leaning into the back seat of the car when his body camera went dark. It was a routine stop on Staten Island. Tinted windows, 4 teenagers inside, the kind of situation police handle dozens of times a week. His partner, Officer Elmer Pastran, stood nearby, telling the teens they smelled marijuana. Everyone was ordered out, and the search began. Pastran lifted floor mats and checked under seats. His own camera shows him saying there was nothing there. The back floor was clear. The car was empty. Then, for a little more than 4 minutes, Ericson's camera cut out. When it came back on, he was suddenly holding a brown cigarette and saying he found a lit joint on the floor behind the driver's seat. 19-year-old Lasu Kuyate was handcuffed and taken to jail. According to the paperwork, it looked like solid police work. Suspicious stop, smell of drugs, discovery confirmed. But the video told a different story, one that would not be understood until much later. The case dragged on as Kuyate sat in custody and appeared in court again and again. Only when the footage was reviewed carefully did investigators notice the missing minutes and the fact that the area where Ericson claimed he found the joint had been empty before his camera cut out. Prosecutors dropped the charge immediately. But a question remained. If the marijuana didn't come from the car, how did it get there? Weeks later, the same 2 officers made another stop. This time, the passenger was Jason Serrano, still recovering from surgery after a stabbing. Ericson ordered him out of the car. Serrano said he could barely move, but the encounter escalated quickly. Moments later, he was on the ground, handcuffed, wincing in pain. As officers searched, Ericson's camera caught his voice, low and direct. "We gotta find something." At first, he said he didn't see anything. Then, later in the footage, loose marijuana appears in the car's cup holder. Serrano was charged with resisting arrest and possession. He couldn't afford bail. Afraid of being stuck on Rikers Island, he took a plea simply to go home, even though he insisted the drugs weren't his. For 2 years, nothing changed. The paperwork supported the officers. The plea stood, and the system moved on. Then the full body camera footage was released publicly. Frame by frame, lawyers and judges watched the same pattern emerge. Pretext stops, claims about odor, pressure to justify the search, and drugs appearing only after officers had already said there was nothing there. In 2021, Serrano's conviction was overturned. A judge wrote that the video appeared to show drugs being planted, and prosecutors dismissed the remaining charges. Despite that, Ericson and Pastran were never criminally charged. Internal reviews cited camera issues, recommended training, and listed allegations as unfounded. Both officers stayed on duty. For the people they arrested, the consequences were very different. Jail time, court dates, records that shaped how employers and landlords saw them. Even when those records were erased later, the damage had already been done. Number 10. Officer Adam Schneider. Officer Adam Schneider was standing beside Shane Clark's car when the search began. Clark had been stopped, pulled out, and told to wait, while Schneider went through the vehicle. Within minutes, Schneider said he had found methamphetamine. Clark was handcuffed, arrested, and taken to jail. To anyone looking at the paperwork, it appeared straightforward, a simple stop that turned into a drug case. Clark, however, insisted the drugs had never been his, and almost 2 weeks later, prosecutors quietly dismissed the charges without explanation. He walked out of jail, confused, embarrassed, and still carrying the weight of an arrest record. He later filed a legal claim saying what he believed had happened: the drugs had been planted. That allegation would gain context when investigators began examining Schneider's work more closely. By the summer of 2021, concerns inside the New Albany Police Department had reached the Indiana State Police. Detectives were asked to look into Schneider not for a single case, but for his broader conduct. What they uncovered went beyond one arrest. Investigators learned that Schneider had been maintaining an inappropriate relationship with a confidential informant, a woman who was actively helping police build drug cases. According to court documents, she told detectives that Schneider knew she possessed methamphetamine on multiple occasions. Instead of seizing it or filing charges, he told her to get rid of it, or in some situations, to sell it. At the same time, their relationship blurred every ethical line. The person reporting crime was also intimately tied to the officer responsible for handling her. The investigation expanded again when state police examined Schneider's phone. Hidden among personal files were videos showing women changing clothes in a private dressing room. Detectives eventually traced the room back to a business operating out of Schneider's home. The camera had been hidden. The women had no idea they were being recorded. Prosecutors filed felony voyeurism charges in a neighboring county. By this point, a picture was forming. Schneider wasn't just bending rules, he was shaping situations to his advantage, deciding when laws applied and when they didn't. Evidence wasn't always something to secure and document. Sometimes, according to investigators, it became something to manage, to move, or to ignore, depending on what was useful. That is where the Shane Clark arrest took on new meaning. Clark's lawsuit claimed that Schneider had taken drugs found on the confidential informant and used those same drugs in the case against him. Clark spent nearly 2 weeks in jail before everything disappeared from the docket. The case never went to trial. There was no jury. The charges were simply gone. And although the allegation was never prosecuted as a criminal offense, it fit uncomfortably with what investigators were already seeing. By December 2021, Schneider was in court himself. He stood before a judge and admitted guilt, not to drug planting, but to official misconduct and interference with the reporting of a crime. He pleaded guilty, agreed to resign from the New Albany Police Department, and was placed on probation. The remaining obstruction charges were dismissed as part of the plea deal. In the records, Schneider eventually lost his badge, but not his freedom. He did not go to prison. He left with probation, a felony conviction, and civil lawsuits still moving in the background. Meanwhile, the people tied to his cases had already spent time in jail, paid legal fees, and carried charges that shaped their lives long before the truth caught up. In every one of these cases, the problem wasn't just the drugs. It was the trust that was broken. When evidence can be planted, the system stops reflecting truth and starts reflecting whoever is willing to manipulate it. These stories remind us that accountability isn't optional. It's the only thing that keeps justice real. If you found this series helpful, stay with us, subscribe, share, and let us know which cases you think we should investigate next.